Building a family can be a complicated, messy, lonely, and sometimes heartbreaking process. But you don't have to navigate this challenging journey alone. Welcome to the All Paths podcast, where we support and celebrate all of the different ways there are to try to grow your family. We're your hosts, Emily and Leanne, from the nonprofit organization All Paths Family Building. And today we're talking with Will about his family and journey. Will, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me. I'm excited to talk with you. This is definitely something that I've always been very passionate about. Never had a chance to be on a podcast about it. So excited to have this conversation with you guys.
Oh, wonderful. We're excited that you're here. So before we get into your story, we'd love for you just to introduce yourself really quickly for our listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name's Will. I was born and raised in Boston, Massachusetts. Now live in Austin, Texas. But my connection to adoption, I am an adoptee myself. I was adopted at birth from a Brazilian birth mother who was in Massachusetts. And was, like I said, born and raised in Boston, and didn't have any connection with my birth family until much later in life, which is an interesting story. Maybe we'll get into that at some point today. And now, as I am in my mid to late 30s, let's call it mid 30s to save myself a little grace here. In my mid 30s, I do have a relationship with my birth family, and now have started my own family, in which me and my wife recently adopted a now 10 and a half month old baby, almost 11 months, which feels pretty crazy. So yeah, I'm excited to be here, and my adoption story goes in a lot of different directions. So I'm excited to see what we get to talk about today.
Yeah, this is great. Thanks, Will, for sharing. I am excited to dig into all of this with you. You have a unique perspective on family building as both an adoptee and an adoptive parent. So I'm curious, growing up, what were your earliest memories of knowing about how your family was built?
Good question. It's funny. I think about this, and I do, if I do interject too much, try to interject humor into this. I do apologize. It's just kind of my default setting.
No need to apologize.
But one of the things that when I think about like that question, Leanne, is like, for me, I didn't necessarily really have a choice. So I myself, as I mentioned, my birth mother was Brazilian. My adoptive parents, my parents, are very, very white. So it was pretty apparent from an early age. My mom is Irish Catholic from Boston, like stereotypical, what you would think of. And then my dad is Scottish Canadian. So there was never really too much time to really think of anything else other than like, hey, how did this happen? Once you kind of put things together. So with my family, we were very open about it from the beginning. I know early on, I just remember adoption being a word that I just seemingly always knew. I mean, I'm sure that's not the case, obviously, but I can't even really think of a time where this wasn't a part of the conversation in my household. It just seemed very normal to me. So it wasn't anything that I even had a chance to think about as not being something that could be a part of a family or would be a part of a family. Obviously, I was aware that that's not how all families were created, but I didn't think anything different of it really
Oh.
when I was younger. And I think part of that was we did have an adoption group that we were a part of. So I did have others that, I saw around me that were like, oh, hey, this is how our families are. And, other families were done their way. And that's cool. There's just different ways to do it. So I think for me, my earliest memory is that I don't have a memory of it not being a thing. It was just something that's always been present in my life.
That's wonderful that it was just part of that conversation from, day one, that you don't have that memory of like being
Yeah.
sat down and told this huge, life altering fact about yourself. But can you talk to us? What was it like growing up? Like you said, you were adopted by a very white family. Your multiracial, multicultural adoption experience being in Boston. What was that like?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's something that I think as an adult I reflect on more than certainly in the moment, and I grew up in a very Irish Catholic Italian part of Boston. So I grew up in Dorchester, which Dorchester, for those of you that know Massachusetts or know Boston, is very diverse. But in the section that I was in, it was primarily white. And so, I think to this day, I always say my best friend who I've been friends with since I was 2 years old. He's half Asian, half white. He has two brothers and sisters that are the same thing. obviously. And so I think we partially connected just because we were two of the only non truly white looking kids, and we were 2 years old, and we've been friends ever since. And it's funny, we joke, like, I think that had to be part of it. We just kind of saw each other, and that was like, all right, this is like, we found the similarities. And so, I think depending on what time you would have asked me this question, Emily, I have different answers in my life for what I thought about it. There was a time where I probably didn't notice. I think there was a time where I started to get older, and I think I'm really glad when I look back on it that I went into public schools as opposed to private schools. Because there was a lot more diversity. There was a lot more chances to see myself in other cultures that I'm like, oh, things I didn't know about, learn about new diverse experiences. And I think that then changed my thinking of how I felt maybe from 7 to 12 when I was primarily just in my neighborhood or in my community. So it was one of those things that I think over time there's definitely instances where I look back and I'm like, oh, I was actually probably dealing with some identity issues with trying to figure out who I was, and that's tied to being adopted by white parents, and being a Latino kid myself. Like there was stuff that I think like I didn't realize at the time, but I look back on it. And so, growing up, it was something that definitely was more present than I think I realized. And then throughout different periods of my life, it became more present. And I think as I got older, it definitely seeped into how I tried to figure out who I was as a person, which, to be clear, I think for even non-adopted people, that's just a general course of life. Is that as you get older, you start to understand and figure out who you are as a person. Um, and so, I'm being a little bit long-winded here, and I do apologize for that. But I think it's one of those things that it affected me in different ways at different times. But overall, I think because of the way that my parents, like, to the first question that Leanne asked, like, this has always just been a part of my life. I did get to see others. I was involved in more, diverse aspects in my city. Like I had as much exposure as, is there was different set of resources today that I have with my child than they had with me. I think that they did their best to the point where it was something that didn't have an overbearing effect. But as I get older, I definitely find moments where I'm like, that was probably an identity thing that I was
Mm,
dealing with, and I wasn't even aware of it at the time.
yeah. Thank you so much for sharing all that. It's a question that we see a lot of adoptive parents struggle with when they're,
Hmm.
even in the process saying, do I have the capability to nurture a child, to parent a child who might come from a different racial or cultural background to me, in a way that means that, they are feeling okay about it at the end.
Yeah.
Um, so it's definitely, yeah, definitely a challenge. And it sounds like, it's really lovely the resources that your parents had. And is there anything like specifically that they did that you're like every adoptive parent who is thinking about a multiracial adoption should consider this?
So it's interesting because I've talked about this with some family members that are also going through the adoption process. And I told them the story that's like a very minute, random story that for some reason I thought about it last night, thinking about coming on the podcast today, where I was born in '89, so I was raised in the '90s, and like I think about the resources we have today versus the resources they had back then. And my parents were very open about adoption, but I don't think they really had the know-how to expose me to like Brazilian or Latino culture. Like that just wasn't something they knew how to do. And like, now it'd be very easy. Like, hey, let's go find Latino festivals and cultures, and let's go do, different. There's going to be a lot easier ways to go find these resources. But something that I think is important for people to hear is like, you're never going to be perfect, but just having the intention is what's going to matter a lot to your current child or future potential child. And so I think of this one moment where there was like the local library had some type of like book giveaway or something. I don't even remember the exact details. But I remember my dad came home with this book that was like, it had this green binding. And I don't remember the title. It was something about Brazil. But I know to him, he was just like, oh, I want my son to know more about where he comes from. And he brought home this book. Now, I think he brought it home to like a 7-year old. And if you open it up, it's like textbooks that like a college student should read. So the intention was there. I don't think I ever opened that book other than looking to see if there were like pictures and stuff. Like I didn't really read it, but that has always stood out to me. And so, I think the openness and the intentionality that he put into that little moment like really stood out to me. And that's something that I think all parents can take away from this messaging is like, you're never going to be perfect. There's never going to be 100% right way to do it. You're probably going to make a mistake either by doing something too much or not doing enough. Like that's just a reality of something that will probably happen. And that's also part of parenting in general. But I think if the intentionality and, the effort and the attempt is there, then you're doing everything that you can ask for, right? And then if the child is open to responding and engaging, then just listen and be open to what they were. Like, I don't think I really pushed it back and asked many questions, but for some reason, that one little gesture that my father made 25, 30 years ago, I still remember it to this day.
I think that can be so reassuring to people that, it is the small gestures and it's meeting kids where they are. And so
Yeah.
even though it was maybe a college level textbook, you took from it what was important to you at the time, which was really just like the acknowledgement of some of your heritage. So I think that's beautiful. You mentioned that you have a relationship with or are in contact with your birth parent. Can you talk a
Mhm.
little bit more about that and how that came to be?
So my adoption was at the time, it was, I don't know if it was technically closed or semi open, so it was a bit of a unique situation. My birth mother was here illegally at the time, and it had, and I think we technically went through like a international adoption agency, but because she was here illegal, I don't know, it's a little bit, it was 1989, it's a long time ago. So long story short, she gave me up for adoption, and I was adopted, I think 7 days after I was born to my parents. And all I ever knew for my entire life was that I had a birth mother from Brazil. I knew her first name, and I knew that she had another son who was about 4 to 5 years older than me. That was like the only information I had. Now, Brazil is a very big country, so it wasn't a lot to work off of, but it was always something that kind of stuck with me and something I had thought about a lot. So I knew when I got to college at some point, like I wanted to explore studying abroad. And so, it took me a couple tries because I went into the study abroad office as a freshman, again as a sophomore, again as a junior, and was like poking around. And like eventually, my first semester senior year, I was like, all right, I'm just going to do it. I need to go to Brazil. I want to understand more about myself, a culture that I have not been connected with for 21 years at this point, other than just being able to say I'm Brazilian and I know a little bit about soccer. And my soccer knowledge is not nearly the same as the rest of my Boston sports. So, it was minimal at best. And so I wanted to go and explore what this would look like. And so before I left, one of the things that I wanted to do is, in my head, I had always built up like I wanted to at least put in an effort to try to find my birth family. I didn't know when that would be, but that was just like at some point in life that was a goal of mine. And so I was like, you know what, I'm going to be here. So let me at least contact my adoption agency and see if they have more information than what my parents, and not that my parents were hiding anything, but just like we had minimal information. I was like, there might be other stuff that they can release to me now that I'm over 18. I can call
Yeah.
and, get whatever. And so I called in and they were like, hey, we only have, they literally spewed back to me the same information my mom had shared with me many times as a child whenever I had asked. And I was like, okay, cool. Just wanted to do my due diligence, not a problem. And then and I think I'd called them maybe like 2 or 3 months before I was going to leave for Brazil. And about a week or two before I left, they called me back and said that they had, and I didn't ask them to do this, but they had kept kind of looking around for any other information. They found the information of the woman who my birth mother had stayed with while I was pregnant. So that was her emergency contact. Somehow, 21 years later, she was at that same phone number. And
Oh,
so they
wow.
contacted her, and then she said she was not in touch with my birth mom, but that she would try to find her. And through some level of different Brazilian connections from Brockton, Massachusetts, all the way to, Minas Gerais, which is the state that my birth family is from. We found the connection, and the connection was made, and it was made about 2 months into my study abroad. And from there, my best friend, who I've already mentioned from when I was two, he flew out. We filmed it. We met. I got to meet them for the first time. So I was, I think, either 21 or 22 at that time. And I'm 36 now. And so over the last 14 years, we've built a relationship. I've been back to Brazil a couple of times. I haven't been back in the last like 6 or 7 years, but I helped her get a visa. She's been over here to the US a couple times. She was over here recently for my wedding about a year ago, which was really nice. She got to meet my wife. She's met my father now as well. My mother had already passed away, but it was something I know that they really wanted to do, was eventually meet. So that was really nice. So we've maintained a relationship. I've met my older brother. I have a younger sister, younger brother. And so now we maintain a relationship. It's definitely a new wrinkle. It's a unique relationship. It's really definitely hard to say it's a one-to-one to anything else of anyone else that I know in my life as to what that relationship looks like. But it's something that I'm glad that I have in my life. It comes with, the same thing that any relationship does, where it has its ups and downs, its communications, and there's its struggles, but there's its beauty as well. So it's something that we continue to work on. But over the last 14 years, I'm definitely happy that that is now a part of my life and that I can make that connection with my birth mother and with my siblings, and even aunts and uncles. And it's constantly like I can probably pull up my phone right now, and I'm sure I have an Instagram or a Facebook request from somebody I've never met, but they know about me from my family in Brazil, and they're checking in to see how I'm doing. And so it's nice to have a new element of that side of myself and family that comes from a very different perspective.
Well, that's really wonderful. I'm so glad that the adoption agency was able to kind of search back and kick all of
Yeah,
this off.
did it all on their own. I did not ask that. They caught me very off guard, about, like I said, a week or two before I left, and I was like, oh wow, this is like actually a possibility. I already resigned myself that this wouldn't happen now, and I was okay with that, and I was ecstatic, but also it brought on a whole new level of nerves, but it ended up working out, so it was great.
Yeah. And it is interesting to see how just the adoption landscape has changed. Closed adoptions still exist in theory.
Mhm.
They're more of a no contact versus closed, like you will never be able to find this person because I mean, we live in the age where you can DNA test and like
Right.
it's super easy to find people. So that level of, absolute 100% anonymity just can't be guaranteed anymore. So it's nice that, even coming from an earlier time where there were those doors
Mhm.
saying you might not ever be able to trace this person unless you
Right.
go the DNA testing route that you were able to find each other.
Yeah, it was beautiful. Like you said, I always had it in my head that this would be something I would explore. Little did I know that, like, if I had waited, 5 years, I would have just done a DNA test, and all of a sudden I would have had all this information at my fingertips. But I actually, probably as times change, like there's part of me that is pretty happy that this happened as organically, as it did. So I'm really happy that it happened when it happened.
So when it came time to build your own family,
Mhm.
how did you approach that?
So it's something that it's funny. Once my wife and I adopted our baby now, I soon realized after talking to some friends and family that have been in my life for a while how much apparently I have talked about this, that I've always wanted to adopt. Like that had always been something that for me, regardless of who my partner is that I ended up with, that was something that I wanted to be part of my family planning. It so happened that this became for us the primary family planning tool for different reasons. But it was always something, even if a pregnancy was something that, was going to be something that my partner wanted to do, this was going to be something else that I was going to want to be a part of in the sense that, I think for me, adoption has always, I've looked at it as something in a pay it forward almost type of sense, because I do think that with adoption, while there are obviously complications, I think there's complications in life in general. Like, I don't think adoption is all that different from the complications that you would see outside of this, but because it is viewed differently, it comes with certain stigmas that I think, part of this podcast and part of what we do, as advocates, try to kind of break those walls down a bit. And so for me, that was always going to be something that I wanted to explore as part of family planning. Like I said, it just so happened that this became our primary tool for different reasons. So it was something that even early on, when my wife and I were just in our dating phases, that I was that, and it was anyone that I dated that was very open, like, hey, at some point, if we're going to talk about kids, like I'm going to talk about adoption, like that's going to be something that is a part of our discussion. And that's not always the case, right? I know for a lot of families, like adoption is something they don't even think of, and then they get to it, and then it becomes like a part for all these other reasons. And so with us, I know it is a little bit unique that I've always just been kind of very forthright of adoption will ideally be a part of our family. And, now being having gone through that process, and having the daughter that we have, it's one of those things where I was on the other side of it, and now being on this side of things, like each side presents complications, but again, I think both sides present such beautiful opportunities that not everyone gets a chance to experience. And to me, I think of it far more as just like an absolute blessing in a lot of different senses.
Yeah. You mentioned some of the stigma that can still exist. And we do spend a lot of time on this podcast trying to help people with thinking through those and resources to support. What are some of the big ones that you see that you really want to address and help people think about in a different way?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the stigma, around adoption is, it's not for me. I can't do that. And this goes on either side, whether you're, a mom that is making the decision to give your child up for adoption, or if you're in the boat of, looking for how you're going to plan for your family. Like I know I've seen it, and I it's one of those things where, again, I feel like there's people that would say, and this is not how I would view it, is that adoption is not the quote unquote normal way to have a family.
Mm.
And something that I always like to think of is I think normal is kind of a myth. Like what does normal mean to have a family? There's so many different things that when I look at, I mentioned before, like I think there's identity issues that I have that probably come from forms of adoption. I know plenty of friends that have identity issues that were never adopted. So, this is a human element to have, a human feeling to have. It's a different way, but I don't think it's not normal. And so I think that's the biggest thing for me is just normalizing this as just another way to have a family. There's a lot of biracial families with natural births. I'm from a biracial family of an adoptive birth. There's a lot of similarities, but we got there different ways to start, but a lot of the same, trials, tribulations, experiences, we're going to share that along the way. So I think for me, it's just the normalization of it is something that I try to emphasize. And then also, you know, several years ago, I wanted to get more involved with adoption here. I live in Austin, Texas. And I was like, I had no idea how to do this. I just started looking up like Facebook groups and, something that I hadn't taken into account is there was a lot of people that feel like, adoption and I don't, and, it brought on these like great traumas to them. People, no one understands them. And I was a side that I honestly had not explored. And it is something that was, eye-opening to me. I'm like, oh, this is definitely a side of adoption that I wasn't aware of. But I do think that, while that's a reality, I think people who are, kids of divorce, kids of tragedies that have happened, like there's, and those are two examples, but there's so many other examples that you could really go through that I'm sure have those same type of issues. So again, I think it's still a human experience. So to me, the stigma around adoption not being normal is probably the biggest one that
Mm.
if I hear it, I want to change that because I think it's just a different way, but I don't think it's any different than whatever else would be considered normal, which again, I don't think exists.
Yeah, I love that. I completely agree.
So you mentioned the resources that were available to your parents
Mhm.
as they were normalizing this family building pathway for you as a child. What resources or support communities have been helpful for you now being on the other side as an adoptive parent?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, being here is a great one. Like my cousin's the one that connected us. So like, having those type of, open conversations have really helped to kind of expand our reach. Like even here in Austin, the adoption agency that we chose it because of a friend went through them and we met with them. Now we're friends with them and their daughter and they recently adopted a second child, and like through them, we've created like our own group. I mentioned before, I grew up kind of with an adoption group, and so I think that having some type of adoptive community is something that's important, and it's just like with anything in life, if you love books, you love being around other people that love to read books. If you love sports, you love talking about that with other people that do that as well. So having these shared experiences, I do think is something that's important. I mean, I think in general, when I was thinking about like my parents' resources, and my daughter is Mexican, my wife is Mexican. She's gonna have a very Latino experience growing up as a child. She'll feel probably much more connected to her culture than I did growing up. But like what I think about and speaking to biracial adoptive parents is like now I feel like there are so many more opportunities to, if you are two white people with a Latino child, as I mentioned, like you're able to now in a quick Google search or chat GPT, whatever you prefer to use at this point, it's pretty easy to find out, hey, where are there, Brazilian festivals or Brazilian celebrations that I can find and help educate my child. And there's things like that that you can do that I think are really important, that I think, unless, at least for me growing up, like, we didn't have a computer until I was like 10 or 11, right? Like, now we have it in our, in our pockets everywhere that we go, and we have it in multiple places. And so I just think the availability for information and resource to make these connections, regardless of really, economic status. It wasn't like my parents were going to fly me to Brazil and like, hey, let's go check all this out. Although if you can do that, that's great. I think I would encourage that, but not everybody can do that. And so I think even just within your local community, exposing your child to whatever their heritage or their background is really important. And then also just different diversities. Again, my best friend is half Asian, and so looking at that, it's just like, hey, we both are not white. You're not Latino, I'm not Asian, but there is something here that connects us, right? And so I think being able to have those different perspectives, like, that is something that I would encourage to utilize resources, and those resources can come from anywhere. I think there's some that are adoption specific. I think that are some are just specific to your situation.
Yeah. I'm curious, as you started the process of building your family with such intention, obviously, how did your experience with both growing up and then finding your birth mother later in life and the steps that you went through, how did that sort of guide you in the choices you made? Everything from like the agency you chose, to what type of relationship, if any, you wanted to have with the
Mhm.
birth parent of your daughter. How did that all come together for you?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, and it's one where I think it was, even if I didn't have the experience, like, I think it still makes it just these are all really difficult decisions to still try to figure out. And I think choosing the agency, I think that's actually something that for parents that are, going through this process and haven't chosen it, I think that's one of the most important things you can do is choose the right agency for you. And that answer is different for everybody, right? So I think when you think about the timeline of adoption, most people are like, oh, from the time, how long were you, waiting for a child? I don't think a lot of people consider like the research that goes into the agency, that goes into, everything else that you mentioned, Leanne. We had to do DNA checks, we had to do house, approvals, everything else. Like, it's a long timeline. So, I think using my own experience in what we were looking for, I think it was beneficial. I think it was still probably just as difficult for someone that hadn't gone through it. But I do think, knowing what it's like to basically live through a closed adoption for 22 years and then be part of an open adoption for 14 years, if you kind of break it
Uh-huh.
down that way, it did give me a unique perspective. And I do think that for us, one of the things that we decided was right for us is that, like, we wanted an open adoption. We would be okay with a semi-open adoption with opportunities. And, I mean, like you said, like, there's only so many limits you can put on it these days with how much technology is available. But it was something that for us would be ideal, is that we know, and I know from personal experience, like, I grew up a lot of times, wondering, like, what information's out there. We didn't have any information. So just wondering, like, hey, I wonder what my birth mom's doing in Brazil right now. I wonder, if I have like what other family, or just wondering, like, I wonder if she'll just show up one day, right? Like, there's just things like that that would pop into my head. So knowing that that would be something that would potentially be for our child, I think having that connective tissue to the birth parent is for us was the ideal situation. And we're 10, 11 months into it, and thankfully, right now we do have a great relationship with my daughter's birth mother. It's something that we hope to continue to foster. But one of the things that I now know, having been on the side of having that relationship, it does come with complications. Like, it's not all smooth. Like, there's going to be ups and downs. But again, back to the normalization, every relationship in your life has complications. There probably isn't a single one that is smooth. And so it's things that you work on. And if it's meaningful, that's what you do. You put the work into it, and you make it work for you and for those that are important. So I think it influenced us in the sense of knowing that we did want to do an open adoption, that ideally we wanted to have a relationship. Um, but one of the things that I always think about is you can only control what you can control, right? It's a saying that a lot of people have heard before. So some of those things are ideal, but it didn't mean that that's what was going to happen, right? Because we can only control so much. But I think that's when you're in the application process. I think you need to think of your ideals, but be okay to kind of be flexible. And that's the way that we approached it, is that we had our ideal scenarios, but then that we were ready to be flexible when needed.
Yeah, that's so relevant in all paths to building a family, is that you always have your ideals, and we always have to be flexible to however things are unfolding, because nothing
Right.
goes as planned.
So thinking about open in a different context, you grew up, like you said, you didn't remember a time when you didn't know that you
Hmm.
were adopted. What conversations are you having? Or, I mean, I know your daughter's only 10 months old, but, how are you talking with her about this already? Are you talking with her about this already? What conversations do you plan on having in the future? How are you approaching that now?
Yeah, it's so we're not having a ton of conversation with her yet. I mean, it is something that, like, as we have a relationship with her birth mother, like, we share pictures, we talk about her, like, to her, how much she's comprehending. I don't know, but to a degree, babies are always, they're computers, they're intaking everything. So I think right now we're more at the stage of, like, once, because it's one of those things where 10 months, 11 months is going to turn into, all of a sudden she's running around, she's talking, having full conversations before we know it. So I think that one of the things that we're starting off just early on is, like, how do we want this to be introduced, right? Like, we want to be, one thing that we've agreed upon is we're going to be open, right? Like, it's not going to be, it's never going to be hidden from her. She's going to know from the moment that she can ask questions that it will be open, and honesty is kind of like our policy. I think the thing that we are trying to now navigate as parents, and this is something my parents didn't really have to. It wasn't even really an option, right? So for us, it's more, and again, this gets back to us communicating with the birth mom as well too, and what she's open to, what she wants, what she's comfortable with. And I think for us, it's trying to strike that balance, because we don't want to then explain this to our daughter and overpromise something to her that then we later find out is something that the birth mom is not okay with, because then that creates this, this tension, this issue, this trauma that, we were, again, be flexible, because we're not going to be able to control everything, but control what we can. And so try to get ahead of that as much as we can and stay coordinated. And I think right now we're in a position that we can still do that with the birth mom. I think every single parental situation is going to be a little bit different. So for us, we're still in kind of the coordinating game planning phases. We are open about it as far as just talking about it. Like, again, like I said, it's normal. That's just a part of life. It's a part of her life. It's a part of our life. It's a part of life that goes on around you. And between the friends that we have, between the family we have that have gone through adoption, like, she's going to be very exposed to this, in just our natural family structure. um so I think that's kind of where we're at now. There's still game planning. I don't know that we have that fully fleshed out yet, but it is conversations that we're having around how best to do it. But it's something where in the 10 and a half months, like, she has seen her birth mother again, like since the birth. She's already seen her a couple times, actually, because she was premature and she was in the hospital for a little bit. So we've had a chance to build that relationship, and the birth mom has had a chance to be with our daughter for a little bit as well too. So again, for us, it's the normalization, and then just how to we make sure that we are accounting not just for our daughter's feelings and emotions, but also for the birth mother as well, because I think that's the important part about this open, when you do have the open adoption, is, like, it's not just, and of course that's where your number one concern is going to be, is your daughter, your son, whatever. But it is also this extremely brave choice that this other human being has made. And again, if your goal is to have a full relationship of whatever that may look like between you, the birth mom, the birth family, and your son or daughter, like, you have to be mindful of them as well. And so I think for us, it's just trying to take into account both of those as we get closer to having this introduction where, it becomes a memory. And maybe my question to my daughter of what Leanne asked me is going to be a little bit different, because she's going to be able to say, oh yeah, I remember meeting, my birth mom at whatever however it may happen. So um, game planning with care, I think, is probably the best way that I can answer that.
I love it. And that it is it does always sound funny to like ask what conversations you're having with a 10-month-old, but it is something that a lot of mental health professionals in this space recommend starting, when they are that little, whether, you're talking about adoption or donor conception or surrogacy or whoever, however your family was built.
Yeah.
Less so for the child at that point, although, that does help because, whenever they hit that point where they're um forming those memories and able to comprehend, even a little bit what's going on. So there's never that moment of, oh, this is when I found out. It's just always part of their story, but also as a tool so that parents can get comfortable. So you're not stumbling over your words, trying to figure out, oh, how am I saying this when they're sitting there looking back at you, like fully comprehending what's going on.
Right. And that
You've
happens
had a
quickly,
chance to
right?
practice. Yeah. You've had a chance to
Yes.
practice and like work all that out while they were just, happily bopping along and didn't really pick up what you were talking about.
Yeah, no, and you're 1,000% right. And I think that's as we get closer to she's in the you're about to crawl, about to walk, and then it comes about to talk, right? So it's all these phases that are going to come really quickly. So that's where I think we are is like we're discussing it, but then also I think the next level is like that almost simulated conversation, so that we are prepared when it does happen.
Well, along those lines, you mentioned how the adoptive group that you grew up with was very instrumental for you. Have you thought about that for your family now? And what do you recommend for people as to when to reach out and when to think about joining groups?
Yeah, I mean, this was something that, like I said, we got lucky that we got connected to a family that had used our adoption agency before through a friend of a friend, and now we've developed a relationship with them. And I think this is something that they had like thought about, and then I mentioned that, in my experience growing up, I was a part of one, and that like we would be very interested. So, it kind of came up organically, that this group was created. To my knowledge, there wasn't anything that our adoption agency specifically had, and so this is like, or some of the adoptive families in our group did go with the agency that we used. Others are from different agencies, but live, in the general area and know somebody within the group. And so I didn't even have a chance to really look for it because the friends that we were working with already kind of had this organized by the time our daughter was here. And we were like, perfect. This is exactly kind of what we need. But I would say for, I think this would be honestly more for adoptions. I wish our adoption agency had offered or had was a little bit more positioned to do something like this, or had a bit more organization towards this. Like this would be more of a message, less so to adoptive parents, but to adoption agencies, in my opinion, that I think this should be part of their services. It's like
Mm.
connecting it, and of course, they can only do so much as far as connecting and having certain spaces. But that is one thing that from the different agencies that that we viewed. Um, a little bit here and there, but I do think that's something that adoption agencies could be doing a bit more of, in my perspective, is keeping that connection and that bond, because again, the the shared experience means so much, and it's so meaningful to have those groups to be able to connect with. That it's great that we were able to find a group that did it on their own, but it's tough for us because we all have these different lives to be able to manage and add that as just one more thing on our plate. So I think for adoption agencies, if they can help to coordinate that a bit more, I think that is something that goes a long way in the advocacy of adoption long term, as opposed to just kind of, hey, we're here for this process, and then once we're past the 6 month whatever finalization process, and then we're kind of removed. Like I think that's something that adoption agencies could be doing more of, in my opinion. And so for adoptive parents, like I wish I had better advice. It's you got to kind of, depending on where you are, it's a lot of your own research that you'll probably have to do. But I definitely would recommend, trying to seek that out. And some adoption agencies will be more helpful than others in that respect, but I think sometimes it does take a little bit of on your own trying to figure out, and then figure out which type of group is best for you depending on where you are in the journey as well.
Yeah.
And you mentioned our group earlier, and like that's a great place for people to connect, but it's focused on the intended parents. It's not definitely a resource for the kids once, they're in the picture. So being able to
Hmm.
have that sort of like local, everybody can hang out together and the kids can all grow up together. That sort of
Right.
group sounds really ideal. And yeah, If any adoption agency owners are listening, get on that. That would be a really,
Yeah,
really wonderful resource
definitely. I
to
think
add.
a spot that is missing in the adoption world, in my opinion.
Yeah. I feel like we've covered a lot of ground, but is there anything that you want to share that we haven't asked about?
Um, Nothing necessarily in particular. I mean, I guess just speaking to those that are either, um, newly, with their adopted child or are still in the process of figuring it out. We mentioned before, control what you can control and be flexible. I think that's like one of the biggest things that you can think of in this entire process. And I think once you are, paired with your child, like your parent, like I see this with my friends that have similar kids around the same age. We're all parenting the same. We don't know what the hell we're doing. Like we're all trying to figure it out. Like everyone is in that same boat. Um, but I think the process of adoption leading up to it is definitely a little bit different than what you're going to see with your counterparts that are going through a natural pregnancy. Again, everyone has their own challenges. That's a part of life. Um, but I do think control what you can control, be ready to, be flexible. And this is the last part is a lot easier said than done, but get comfortable with the unknown because it's just going to happen. Like, and it's really tough. It's really easy to say. It's really tough to do because there's going to be a lot of unknowns. There's going to be a lot of waiting depending on where you're at in the process. And so, and then you're going to have a lot of people. If you have a good community around you, you're going to have people that are interested and they want to know and they mean it well. And it's sometimes it might get a little tiring and you're like just saying, I don't know, we're sitting here waiting. And you keep saying that over and over again. But it's one of those things that it comes from a good place. And if you have people asking you that, I think you can take solace in that. That means you have a good community around you. And that when that baby does come, you're going to be in a great place. So get comfortable with the unknown because it's going to happen. Control what you can control and be flexible. Be ready to be flexible when needed.
Well, you kind of answered my next question, which is going to be what's one thing that you would say to somebody who is just starting to grow their family? So, anything you want to add, or just say, go back and listen to the last 60 seconds?
Yeah, I mean, and that's my apologies. Like you would think you had said that to me
No,
in advance. It was in my head
it was
thinking
a
about my
great answer.
response to that. Thank you. But yeah, no, I don't have too much to add for it. The other thing that we've already kind of touched on throughout this podcast as well is when choosing your adoption agency, when making the choices of what type of family, what style of family, like do it based upon yourself. Don't do it based upon anyone else. Like you have to make decisions that are best for you and your family. But the one thing that I would say to be okay with is like with most things in life, you have the right to change your mind. So if you think that one way is the right way for you, but you educate yourself more, you have different experiences that change your thoughts and views and opinions, like you can be closed off to something and then open up to something later. Like that's okay. You don't have to stick with, whatever it is that you feel initially. And you can reverse that too. There's things that you can learn more about and say, you know what, actually we're not comfortable with that. And I think you need to be, you need to be advocates for yourself, and that means you and your family, whether that's your husband, your wife, whatever it might be. Like you guys need to be advocates for yourself. And so and don't think of it as whatever the outside world or outside opinions. Like each family is going to be different, so make the decisions based upon yourself and not others.
I
Yeah,
love
that's
that.
really important to think about. What would you say to people who are supporting their loved ones and friends through their family building journey? How can they show up for their friends and their family in a way that can be supportive?
Yeah, so I kind of mentioned it earlier. Like I know at certain points in the adoption process, you're just waiting, right? And so you have a lot of friends or family that are like, "What's going on? What's new?" And like sometimes that can kind of grow on you because you're like, "There's nothing new," and they don't know that, right? You know that because you're sitting with it every day, refreshing your inbox, checking your actual physical mailbox because that becomes a big part of this process. That isn't really a part of anything else in my life anymore, but you're checking those things, waiting to see what's new. And so what I would say to, friends and family of those that are going through it, there's two things. And, one is just kind of being there and being present. I think it's just important. I think that's just really helpful for people to know that they're, not alone in this process. And number two is, it's while you may want to always know, like, hey, what's new, what's updated, sometimes what might be best is that person wants to hang out and have a beer and not talk about that. Maybe they want to talk about something different, but I think, and this is, this is a delicate situation where at the same time, if it is what they want to talk about, have a lending ear to it, right? And so it's kind of to that person being flexible with, hey, trying to understand what the person going through this adoption process, which is going to have ups and downs and lulls, is that some days they may want to unload their emotions to you about what's happening, and some days they just may want a distraction because they may want to take their mind off it for a little bit. And so if you are part of this person's community, part of this person's inner circle, I think, again, being present is the number one thing, in whatever form that takes. Number two is trying to listen to that person and what they need in that time. Do they need an ear for them to vent about the process, for them to talk about, how they're feeling? Or do they need someone to play a game of Scrabble and think about something different? It can take different forms. So I think those would be the kind of two things to those that are, friends or family of those that are going through the process, that those are the best ways that you can help.
Yeah, great advice.
I love that. Well, thank you. Well, this has been really lovely talking with you. Thank you so much for sharing about, your own story, your family's story. Really appreciate how candid you've been. And I know anybody who's listening who might be considering adoption or going through the process will get a lot from this episode.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me. Really, really great to be here. I thought it was a great conversation. Yeah, I really appreciate the work that you guys are doing. I think this is something that is really needed in the adoption space. So thank you guys for having me on and to be a part of it.
Yeah, agree. Thanks for being here and thanks for sharing.
Thank you for listening. We'll see you next week with more family building stories and resources. Be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts so that you never miss an episode. And follow us on social media at allpathsfb, or visit our website, allpathsfb.org, to learn more about our work. And please help spread the word so that anyone who is struggling to grow their family can join the conversation. All Paths Family Building is so grateful to the members of our circle of support. And today we want to recognize and thank Fertility Centers of New England, a first fertility center. Your partnership is vital to our ability to provide emotional support, education, and advocacy that is open to anyone who is struggling to grow their family. And to the entire All Paths community, thank you for being here. It's an honor to walk with you on your journey.